Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Sticky Notes talk. For those of you who don't know, every other Friday at 12:30, we share something around product strategy, design or research, and it's only 15 minutes, so you can watch along on your lunch break on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube and LinkedIn.
Hello everyone.
They're also all recorded, so you can watch them in your own time if you want to have lunch break instead. But this week I am talking about the power of gamification. So let's get the definition out the way. Gamification in its simplest form is where we take design patterns and design elements often found in games and use them to enhance the user's engagement of a product or service, essentially trying to make it more fun. And an example of this could be the badges and levels that you get on things like TripAdvisor. So you're rewarded every time you write a review, but also if you add things to it, like a photo, for example. And badges and levels might be the kind of thing that you think of when you hear the term gamification, but it's actually much more than that. And it's not always digital either. How many of us have loyalty cards of various different shops and businesses? Or even the most basic ones where you get your 10th coffee for free. It gives you that sense of accomplishment each time you buy a coffee and you get a stamp or a sticker. And it also has that sense of progressing towards a goal with a nice reward for completing your quest at the end. That is gamification. However, when you dive in a little bit deeper, you can see things like the Octalysis framework, which sounds very fancy, but it was developed by Yu-Kai Chao. And it focuses on the 8 areas of behavioral science used to make gamification really successful. And that's when I realized it's actually a lot deeper than just using things from games. And although we use some of these elements already in the UX design process, I think the fact that these specific 8 areas are used to make gamification successful is interesting. And Yu-Kai Chao goes into a lot of detail on his website and in his book, but let's take a brief look at these 8 areas. So the first one we have is epic meaning or calling. And this idea is around the fact that people want to have a sense of purpose and to feel that they're important. And an example of how this can be used is the sort of concept of having admins or moderators on online forums or Twitch streams. It makes the user feel important and that they have a sense of duty to uphold, and therefore they're more likely to come back to the site and engage with it more. Then we have empowerment, and this is around the fact that people giving a person the sense that they hold all the power in the situation, and that the product is just providing the tools and space to be powerful. And Lego is actually a great example of this, because when you think about the individual bricks, they're not really anything special, but they do provide the tools for the person to be creative and make something amazing. And you might be able to guess what this one is. But social influence is using people's desire to connect with others, but also their need to have approval and respect from them. The things like likes and hearts on social media are a really good example of this, because it allows people to connect with others by going, yeah, I agree with your post, or I like your photo. And it also gives approval for the person who posted it. And then on top of that, the number of likes and comments you get also allows the person to feel like they have gained respect from others. So it actually answers all of those things around social influence. Then we have unpredictability and curiosity. And this is using people's natural desire to need to know what's going to happen next. And this is why we're motivated to watch movies based on the trailer, or why cliffhangers in books are so effective. However, it is also what is the key driver behind why gambling can be so addictive. Our brain's reward center lights up when we encounter the unexpected situations and sensations. Then we have loss and avoidance. And this is our natural need to avoid losing things that we've spent a lot of time or energy invested in. And is one of the reasons why people, this is quite an old reference, but why people were driven to continually play Farmville, because they couldn't bear the thought of losing all their crops after all the time they've invested. And that's probably even when it's not even fun anymore, but they still continually play it just to avoid that sense of loss. Then we have scarcity, and this is around people's natural need to place a higher value on something that is difficult to obtain or is in limited supply. And this is why we get things like collectibles and limited editions. And it's also what motivates us to buy now in case we miss out. It's the kind of FOMO effect. And then we have ownership. And this is when people have a sense of ownership, they're naturally more invested and connected to it. And the house is actually a good example, because if you're in rented accommodation, you're probably going to spend less time decorating it and making it feel like your own. But once you have owned a property, you're more likely to make it feel like it's your own space because you feel more connected to it. And that's, from a digital point of view, could be a profile page. It feels like if it's your own space, you're more likely to put in effort into customizing it and keeping it updated. And then finally, we have accomplishment. And this is kind of a straightforward one, but we like to feel accomplished and that our effort and time has actually meant something. And this is where we get the things like levels and badges from. People like to see progression and that their effort has been rewarded. So while I went through these, I kind of picked up on the words like needs and desires. And that's because these 8 areas focus heavily on fulfilling those needs and desires. And I feel that gamification is actually around manipulating what motivates us to take action as human beings, which sounds like something that's ingrained in all of us and therefore pretty powerful. What I'm basically saying is, if you've ever been addicted to Candy Crush, it's not your fault. But more importantly, the power of gamification needs to be taken seriously and should be implemented in positive and ethical ways. So a while back, I did a talk on deceptive patterns, and you can still watch that on YouTube if you're interested. But I talked about the fact that it's essentially using behavioral science against the user. And that's kind of what gamification is doing as well. But to me, it seems like it's doing it on a slightly more deeper level, like manipulating the human mind on just another level, which doesn't sit very well with me. And of course, it doesn't mean that the people who are using gamification or designing patterns for it are evil or good. It's all about intent. And so there's a question to ask yourself when you're implementing it. To what end? To what end are you using gamification? Are you using gamification to create a more pleasant and engaging experience for the user, especially for boring or redundant admin tasks like onboarding to yet another new software? Or are you using it to reinforce positive habits that benefit the user? An example could be educational apps where you're trying to learn a new language. Or are you using gamification to create a need for the user to check your app every day? The difference is the user needs to be benefiting from these elements of gamification in some way. But if you are only introducing these elements into your product to drive the user to engage with your app more, without the user gaining anything, that's when there is an issue. It's also important to note that just because the overall goal of the app might be to improve things for the user, like a fitness or language learning app, it doesn't mean that by default, all of their uses of gamification are ethically sound. the ethics of each implementation should be considered. And during a Figma conference, I came across a talk by a woman called Bethany Sonfeld, and she made the Create Reconstance guidelines, which I definitely recommend looking into. I talk about it at the user story quite a lot. And the reason that she defined those guidelines is because of exactly what we have been talking about. In the modern world, the digital space is a huge part of everyone's daily lives. And UX practitioners are currently involved in making decisions that shape those technologies, which is why the ethics of those individuals making those decisions is very important. And the impact of those decisions is why we should be talking more about design ethics. And it's why we at the User Story decided to do an ethics workshop. So one of our company values is design is decisions. The work we produce is built because of a series of decisions we make. So I thought it would be a good idea if, as a team, we define the values that we should all have when making those decisions, and also documenting them. So whenever we have a new team member join, they can follow those same values. And more importantly, it means that we can hold each other accountable if a decision ever goes against one of those values. So we all have our own individual ethics and priorities, but as we started to write them down and group them by theme, we were able to see our ethics as a team. And it's not to say that anything on this list isn't important, but these are our priorities when it comes to our decision-making process. The key themes that came out from the workshop were inclusivity and integrity. We want to make sure that when we are collaborating, the feedback we get comes from different points of views, and we can't do that if we are working on our own. We believe that all users are valid, and of course we want to design for the majority of users, but that doesn't excuse us from ignoring the rest of the users. Then we have empathy is at the heart of everything we do. So of course we do that with each other and our clients, but remembering to really focus on the empathy for users and their well-being. Then we have integrity, so always having insights and evidence as our ways to make decisions and not basing it on opinions. And of course, user needs before business wants. We do care about business wants, but our passion is behind building things for the needs of the users and not purely on what business wants. And lastly, we always want to give users the control and freedom to make sure that they have the power to feel like they have their own decisions. Having all of this documented means that if we were to implement a design pattern or add gamification to an app, we can feel more confident that we have the right values and intent when we're deciding on how it's implemented, but also if it's implemented at all. And our next steps are to work out how we carry this through everything that we do. But I'd recommend for now, if you work at a large company or even in a smaller team in a much bigger company, you can decide on your own ethics as a team and use it in your decision making. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed it, and here are some links that I found during my research. Thanks.